Well, welcome back to episode two of Michael Horner addressing the major uh, curiosity as to how did we possibly get to the point today where our culture actually believes that Christianity is harmful for human flourishing? How do we get here? And last day, we started looking at the overview of what we're going to cover over these series of episodes. But then we began to dive into the problem of where we started going off track, where culture started going off track, or academia started going off track. And today, Michael's just going to recap that a little bit, and then we're going to go into setting the record straight and how history shows that Christianity is actually the most positively transformational worldview there has ever been in human history. Now, if that sounds rather bold, then you're in the right place because Michael is going to really get into this. So, welcome back, Michael, and I'm anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Kirk. I want to put this whole thing in even the broader context of answering the question, how did our culture get to where it is right now when a lot of the ideas and things that people believe are quite shocking to a lot of people. That kind of, in trying to answer that question myself, I identified a number of cultural myths or cultural lies that I thought were contributing to that or were symptoms of this, but then narrowed it down to possibly there's one foundational lie that might be the foundation for most, if not all, of the other lies, and that was the one that you mentioned, that Christianity may be harmful for human flourishing, that a lot of people tend to think this. And I began to wonder, well, where did this come from? That led me to do a deep dive into the history of the impact of Christianity in the last 2,000 years. And what we're going to do today is just have a brief review of this notion of the Dark Ages, which has been the view that came from the Enlightenment, but is still around, that Christianity is harmful for human flourishing. And we'll show that historians do not think that the Dark Ages is a real thing, that it was a myth. But then I want to move from there to the bigger question of, okay, what about any positive impact that Christianity may have had? But even that is within this broader question of, if there is positive impact, if we can see that in history from Christianity, then the bigger question is, well, what should we do about that? If that's a fact, that Christianity is amazingly positively transformational, then how should that change the way we think now and the way we act now? And this is a question that I think both Christian believers should be asking, but also people who are not Christian believers should be asking. So
Like
to get back to this,
sociologists.
yes, sociologists, historians, people that are concerned about changing the world, people that are concerned about human flourishing, secular humanists that want to do what is good for human flourishing, and so on and so forth.
And I would even say the individual. At least for me, I have found that Christianity has had a massively positive effect in my own flourishing in every area of life, whether it be relationships, landscape photography, wilderness hiking, whatever you might ask or look
Right.
at.
The implications are not just collective, but they are individual as well. And so that's the broader question. But let's come back to this idea that Christianity is harmful. And where did this idea come from? And so I suggested last week that maybe we can blame the English historian Edward Gibbon to some degree. And that's a little bit tongue in cheek, because he wrote a 6-volume historical work called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it is the sort of quintessential example of Enlightenment history, or the Enlightenment narrative about Christianity and religion in general. And he was kind of assuming the superiority of the then current age of reason concept, which was viewed as the age of reason over and against religious superstition of earlier centuries. Ultimately, it was a not so thinly veiled attack on Christianity as the chief culprit in the demise of the Roman Empire. He faulted Christianity for undermining the tolerant regime of pagan religion and plunging Europe into a millennium long dark age. And he described it as the triumph of barbarism and religion. So it became a popular classic. It captured the zeitgeist of the Enlightenment period. And even 150 years later, someone like Winston Churchill would say how much he loved reading Gibbon's book, and he patterned his own writings and speaking after Gibbon. But that was soon to change, and we're going to see that the consensus among contemporary historians is that Gibbon's characterization of the medieval period or the Middle Ages, as two other terms that are used for the same time period from roughly 500 AD to roughly 1500 AD, his characterization of them as the Dark Ages is no longer tenable. So where did this history of the term, where did this idea or the actual term itself, Dark Ages, come from? It actually came from the 14th century, where there were humanists um, who were wanting to emphasize what is good for humanity and for human flourishing. And they began describing this previous 1,000 years to their time, since the fall of the Roman Empire, as a time of darkness. Now, within Christianity, the concept of lightness and darkness is huge, and so this very idea of using lightness and darkness is coming from Christianity itself. But why did they characterize this previous millennium as darkness? Well, for kind of a silly reason, it seems to me, because the educated Europeans of their time did not write nearly as elegant Latin as the best Roman writers had. And it's hard to believe for many, for me, for sure, that was sufficient reason for them to call the entire time period as backward and dark. But that seemed to be the major point. Now, the
It's a very
unfortunate,
odd way to
yeah,
just have
yeah,
one thing you're going to measure civilization on, and that is writing in Latin.
yeah. Now, this is not to say that there was absolutely nothing else that was part of their thinking, but this was the main one.
Yeah.
Now, the unfortunate thing is that this was picked up during the Reformation by 16th century Protestants, and they were unfortunately too eager to pass on some of the unsubstantiated anti-Catholic judgments that came out of this. But we can be somewhat sympathetic because it's human nature to make one's opponents look as bad as possible. We all do that when we're disagreeing with somebody. And this is also not to say that there was nothing present within Roman Catholicism to criticize. There definitely was much to criticize. There was need for reform. Reformation was needed. And I was personally brought up Roman Catholic, and I have converted to an evangelical view of things. Um, and I think there was a need to change. However, the
Now,
problem was,
just a minute, Michael, before you move on there. You say
yeah,
there was a need for reform or change. Now, the question might be change from what to what, or reform from what to what? Like, are we talking about the standard as culture changes, we need to change with the culture, or are you talking about something else?
yeah, good question. I'm talking about not a change to be consistent with one's current culture, but a change to be consistent with the origin of Christianity, and in particular the biblical understanding of Christianity. Um, Now, this is a much broader topic that I'm not planning to get into here.
No,
I'm
but
only wanting to say that the Roman Catholic Church had, in practice, had strayed from some important biblical teaching and practices. Um, but rather than to get into those details, I just that's just the point I make. It wasn't to be current with the culture.
Yeah.
It was to go back to what Jesus taught and to be consistent with what Jesus taught.
Yeah, I think that sums it up nicely there. I just wanted to just see what, basically, in general, what it was from and to what, but
Yeah.
that sums it up.
The problem was when these Protestant reformers exaggerated, they tended to imply that there was nothing good that had happened in the previous 1,000 years. That basically there was nothing good within the Roman Catholic Church. And I think that is just not true. And that led to the idea of the Dark Ages, and then Enlightenment thinkers like Gibbon, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and many others picked up on this hyperbolic mischaracterization of the Christianity of old, and they started applying it to all of Christianity. And that's where the problem started, and that is just growing since then. And what's really interesting as I've looked at this is that there's been a change now in the thinking of historians of the time. They no longer view this time period as the Dark Ages. In fact, one of the things where I discovered this was in one of these AI, I don't even know the right technological term to use here. One of these AI things called like Chat GPT Poe is one that just came up in some of my research. And here's just a very short quote from this AI accessed site. It says, however, recent research has shown that the Middle Ages was a time of significant cultural, economic, and scientific advancements. The term Dark Ages, in quotation marks, is now considered to be a misnomer, and it's not used by historians and scholars in describing the period of time from the 5th to the 15th century in Europe. Now, for that to be part of some AI function is going to give me means that it's got to be a part of what's out there in the consensus of history right now. I mean, it's not absolute proof, but it's just an additional little point that tells me that no, it is true that there's a broad consensus that the idea of the Dark Ages, well, was actually a hoax. It was a
Now,
hoax.
there's something interesting here I just want to point out, or that I observed from what you're saying, is that sometimes, let's say in the Reformation, the Protestants wanted to maybe portray the Roman Catholic Church in a more negative way than what it actually deserved, and maybe even exaggerate certain things. And these are the very things that I find frustrating even to this day between international relations or even discussions between individuals. But what I want to point out here, and it's coming from what you're saying, is that sometimes we may be tempted to indulge in misrepresenting other people or misrepresenting other groups. And in this case, it came back to bite all of Christianity
Yes.
a couple of centuries later. Like, we're talking hundreds of years later. So we need to be really careful when how we represent people and how we talks, because there may be long-term consequences that are not so great.
Yeah, that's a great application point for all of us. I mean, one of the 10 Commandments is, bear not false witness, because lies are destructive. Lies are destructive. So, picking up on that, then, there has been much criticism of Christianity over the last couple of centuries. One of the criticisms comes from someone like Marx, and this is picked up on even by other secular humanists and um, atheist activists today. And it's the idea that Christianity has done a really poor job in terms of contributing to human flourishing and in terms of changing the world for good. You've had 2,000 years, and you haven't done a good job. So it's time that we, get rid of Christianity and we've got better ideas. And see, this is a result of this belief that the ages were completely dark. And so I want to ask the question, compared to what? Christianity's done a poor job compared to what? We need to understand what the pagan world was like at the time when Christianity came into existence, and in the centuries after that. And if it's done a poor job compared to the rest of history, I don't think that's a fair analysis. And so someone like Tom Holland. Now, Tom Holland is a liberal, secular humanist, agnostic, who really uh, was committed to secular humanist virtues. And he thought that these virtues are rooted in the ancient Greek and Roman times. And he went back to study history and to see more about the history of these virtues that he believed in strongly. And when he studied the ancient Greeks, Spartans of Greece, and the Romans, he found that their treatment of slaves and women and children to be brutal and far from the values that he admired in modern Western culture. And so then he began to analyze this more carefully. And where if it didn't come from the Romans and the Greeks, where did these values come from? And his analysis that he reveals in his 700-page book called Dominion, and there's a subtitle to that. In fact, there's two different subtitles depending whether you're in the United Kingdom or North America. I forget what they are right now. But Dominion by Tom Holland, his analysis reveals that in the past 2,000 years, most of the good characteristics and values for which Western culture is normally applauded owe their development to Christianity. Now, that is an outrageous claim. And let me actually quote Holland just to drive this point home, and then maybe you might want to jump in here. So Holland says, quote, Christianity is the most transformative and revolutionary ideology that has ever existed. And in its distinctively Western form, it continues to completely saturate the way people in the West view the world.
So that's amazing. No, what I think makes this especially powerful is that Holland, you said, is an agnostic. He's not a Christian.
He fully says he's not a Christian now.
Yeah.
What he has said, this is interesting. What he has said is that I'm morally a Christian.
Okay.
I agree with the moral.
But I think
yeah, go ahead.
this has enormous weight. It's not just an article written by someone who's not a Christian saying this. This is a massive book, a pile of an enormous amount of research that has gone into this, and it's not been biased in favor of Christianity. It started off quite the opposite, looking at, say, ancient Greek culture. And yet this is his findings. And I think it's well worth, for the sake of our listener here, some of them may want to purchase this book, which we don't get a cent for, of course. But what is the name and the title again? It's called Dominion by Tom Holland.
Dominion, and then there is a subtitle afterwards, and it's different depending where you are in the world. But if you have Dominion and Tom Holland, and you Google that, or you go on Amazon, you'll find it. Yeah, and
I noticed
there are other books. In fact, but if you don't want to read the full 700 pages, there are other people that are doing studies as well, and two more accessible books, maybe to the average reader. I'll mention those now. One is called Bullies and Saints by John Dickson. Dickson spelled Dickson. Bullies and Saints by John Dickson. And then another one that is even more accessible is The Air We Breathe. The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener.
Okay, so tell us
about Scrivener.
No, for both of these authors here, what is their bias, or what is are they Christians?
Now, those two authors do happen to be Christians, but they're covering the same time period as Holland did, and coming to the same conclusion, they're also covering the negative side, though. That's something that
Mhm.
we will cover in this series as
Yeah.
well,
Yeah,
because
we
the
have to
story
look at that.
isn't just positive; it's negative as well, and that has implications for us.
Yeah. Well, that's important that we cover the negative side as well. Otherwise, we end up, rather than misrepresent other people, we end up misrepresenting Christianity as well if we don't address some of the more famous things. But
Exactly,
we'll get to
exactly,
those
right.
in time.
And I'm definitely gonna try to do that, and we're gonna move into the positive impact of Christianity in a few moments here. But let's just mention the context that Christianity entered into 2,000 years ago. The ancient pagan context was brutal. The ancient pagan world was really brutal, and the new Christian worldview was rooted in a personal, caring God of love and mercy. But that's sharp contrast to the capricious pagan deities. Um, and these pagan deities were more like uh, juvenile delinquents, more than more than a loving, caring, powerful God of love and mercy.
Well,
And as a
that
result,
reminds me. That reminds me of what Socrates said in the Euthyphro's dialogue, where they're wondering. Euthyphro claimed that he knew what was good, and maybe it's what the gods like. But Socrates points out, but the gods quarrel amongst them or disagree amongst themselves about what they like.
yeah,
And what you just said reminds me of what it was like in classical Greece with these Greek gods having differences of opinion, shall we say?
right. And so the image of God was very different from pagan to Christianity, and then the image of human beings was very different because the Christian view, what it brought that was new, was that human beings were created in the image of the Jewish Christian God, who was a personal, caring God of love and mercy. And so that all of a sudden gave human beings a completely new perspective on their value, worth, and dignity. And we're going to get into that in some more detail in just a minute. But I'm just trying to show the contrast right now with the ancient pagan context and how a new view could actually change things significantly. So let me just say this, that the notion that Europe fell into the Dark Ages was a hoax perpetrated by very anti religious intellectuals such as Voltaire, Gibbon, Thomas Paine, and others who were determined to claim that theirs was the era of enlightenment. So let me just make a couple of quotes here to finish off this section. One is by Rodney Stark, who also has written on the history of Christianity. Also was an agnostic when he started his research. He actually did become a Christian as a result of his research into the history of the social impact of Christianity. And here's something he says about what was going on in the Enlightenment time period. He says the single most remarkable and ironic thing about the Enlightenment is that those who proclaimed it made little or no contribution to the accomplishments they hailed as a revolution in human knowledge, while those responsible for the advances stress the continuity with the past. So, what this means is this: people like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Hume, Gibbon, and many others were literary men, but the primary revolution that they were hailing and calling the Enlightenment was a scientific revolution. And then Stark points out is that even though the literary men who were proclaiming the Enlightenment were irreligious, the central figures in the scientific achievements of the era were actually deeply religious. So this myth of the Dark Ages seemed to seem to be able to be blamed on the irreligious literary side of the Enlightenment, the ones that did all the writing, but the people that actually led to the changes in the actual practice of reason and science were actually very deeply religious people. And so
Yeah,
that is
that's
just going to make
amazing.
one point, and then I'll open it up to you and before we change gears. So the fact is that progress was taking place, or the fact that progress was taking place in the 14th to 18th century was not something that just popped into existence out of thin air. It was a natural continuation of the accelerating curve of progress that had been happening gradually for the previous 1,000 years. That's the counter narrative to the Enlightenment narrative that is more true to the history that we now know. And so let's stop there. And before we move into the
Yeah.
actual positive impact of the Jesus
Well, I
Revolution.
think you've just made an extremely important point. And if I've understood you correctly, and please correct me if I miss something here, those who promoted the Enlightenment actually did not contribute to it, but what they promoted were the advances in science, which, surprise, surprise, were actually being accomplished by people who were Christians, theists. Is
Yeah,
that
not
is that
not
accurate?
necessarily all Orthodox Christians, but definitely
Yeah,
deep
at
religious,
least yes.
including many Christians. Yeah.
Yeah. You know that it's thought by many scholars that the book of Job in the Bible is maybe the oldest book there, but in that book it talks about God's talking to Job, and he points out that he has created the ordinances of the universe that govern the heavens and the earth. These are the laws of nature, so to speak. So it's not surprising that people who believed in a God who has created the laws of nature and the laws of physics would be very much involved in trying to figure out, well, how does nature work? How do these laws work? What are the laws? And so it seems only natural that science would have been promoted or accelerated through those people who believed in a God who has created laws of nature.
It really does. It really does. Yeah. And we're going to get into some more detail about that. So let's jump right in now to actual examples of positive social impact that come from what Glenn Scrivener calls the Jesus Revolution. I think he called it that long before that movie came out. That was called the
Yeah,
Jesus Revolution.
yeah,
But what he means by that is from the teaching and the worldview and practice of that worldview. So the first thing I want to talk about is innovation and invention. So there's different categories of impact here. First one, innovation and invention. And Roddy Stark points out this that the so-called Dark Ages created the first economies that didn't rely on human muscles, and they did it by inventing water mills, perfecting dams, producing paper mechanically, which no other civilization had managed. Other inventions of the Dark Ages, well, Stark points out, how about windmills, the horse collar, horseshoes, the heavy plow, and I'm going to speed up now because this is a long list, fish farming,
sure.
three-cycle crop rotation, cloth manufacturing, chimneys, eyeglasses, and clocks. He says, don't forget the round-bottom ship, the stern post rudder, and the compass. On the cultural front, he adds the university, modern languages, polyphony, or musical harmony, Gothic architecture with its flying buttresses and stained glass. I mean, that's just a short little summary of the innovation and invention that was taking place in this alleged Dark Ages. It doesn't sound as dark as the Enlightenment narrative made it.
Yeah, and when you just see, for example, the difference between someone with some grindstones turning this stone with their hand or the stick sticking out of it, as opposed to, let's say, a water mill where the water is actually turning huge grindstones, turning out vastly more flour, ground wheat per day than whatever we could do. To us, we look at an old windmill or old water mill, we just don't appreciate what that did at the time. But at the time, it was a massive step forward. all these things, clocks, the compass, huge step forward.
Absolutely. So, but maybe even more importantly, another category of impact is one that I touched on briefly a few moments ago, and that is a radically new view of God and a new view of man that comes out of this new religion, Christianity, and the teachings of Jesus, and based on the Old Testament understanding of that God as well. And so this is a God of love and reason, and a man that is made in that image. And this new understanding led to a long list, I think, of changes. And the first one is healthcare and hospitals. See, for Christians, the more fortunate Christians had a responsibility to help those in need. That was just the teaching of Jesus, especially their own spiritual brothers and sisters, but also their pagan neighbors. And a great example of this is the pagan empire. Julian used to, he would complain. This is what he said. He says, the impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well. He was sort of complaining. I mean, he's calling them a bad name. These impious, impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. And he's complaining about this. And he actually tried to get the pagan world to adopt this same attitude of helping people. And he ultimately failed. He couldn't, it just didn't fly in the pagan world. It required a new way of thinking about God and human beings.
Now, why did
And
he call them Galileans?
oh yes, because he understood that the origin of Christianity was Galilee.
Yeah.
So that this view, it came out of this area, and Galilee was not thought very highly of them. So it was a put down. See, what would be an example today? Think of a place that you would call somebody if you wanted to put them down.
You better be careful, because
Yeah,
probably
I'm
somebody.
not gonna come up with one. The listener can come up with their own idea here. But
Yeah,
you know,
what they
think of the
think.
worst place on the earth, and if you wanted to insult somebody, you would say they were from there. So
Yeah.
he was insulting them for actually doing wonderful work of helping pagan people who were in great need. So really interesting. And so when Christians finally gained some political influence later in the 4th and 5th centuries, their practice of caring for the sick and the marginalized led them to actually establish the first hospitals. I mean, at first, the first few hundred years, they didn't have any power or authority. They just were doing this in practice. But once they gained power and authority, they established the first hospitals. And this has continued for nearly 2,000 years. And I mean, how many hospitals can we think of whose title starts with Saint so and so? This is where hospitals came from. Now, this had
Yeah.
wider implications for society and culture because Christians, since they were expected to aid the less fortunate, then they could expect to receive such aid as well. And because they were asked to nurse the sick and the dying, they too would receive such nursing. And because they were asked to love others, they in turn would be loved. And so this was attractive to people to become Christians. And as more people adopted these attitudes and practices, then all of culture could feel greater security against bad times, which always come, right? In short, the Christian understanding of God and humanity fosters an environment that leads to longer, more secure, healthier, and happier lives.
Now, that's interesting, because you're describing a situation where the Christians were intrinsically motivated. They believed this was important. They believed that it was important because God desired them to be involved in healthcare, in helping the poor, the sick. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, of the contrast between, let's say, communism, where it was extrinsically imposed on a population, and how well that worked out or didn't work out, as opposed to intrinsically being motivated and wanting to do this from the inside out, and how much more, I guess there's a feeling of joy and fulfillment when one is doing something that comes from within that they feel is very important, as opposed to being part of a enforced program that maybe the government imposes. No, it's not a question of either or. There's a ton of middle ground, and there's a huge role for, I think, government to play as well. And you'll probably be mentioning some of these things later on.
Well, you've brought up a really good point, and one that will require a discussion on just that whole issue of do you impose your views on culture, or do you try to persuade people to adopt those views by using reason rather than coercion, force, and violence? And I mean, history shows that both have been tried, but it also shows which way has had more success in the long run. And we see even within Christianity, once Christianity gained power, they tended there was a tendency at times to fall back onto the sort of the old Roman Empire way of doing things, which was imposition of authority over people. And they tried to even expand the Christian message of salvation that way, not just good ways or good ideas for society, but the actual religion itself at times was spread by force. But that but then that was shown to have been not a good plan, and Christians self-corrected in that for the most part, but at times fell back into it. And so that whole history is very interesting. And what I'm eventually want to get to now is what about now? If we do come to this conclusion that I want people to draw, that Christianity really is a positive, and it's proven to have been a positive transformational force, then what should that mean for how we should live now, what we should believe and what we should do? That whole issue of, do you impose this upon people, or do you try to persuade them, is going to come up again. And I mean, it's a major part of what everyone's discussing right now in our world. And so we're going to get there. But this issue of the positive accomplishments of Christianity is going to be a part, just like a foundational part, to what we may build on later to help human flourishing. But we're still trying to make this case that Christianity has had a positive impact. So let's get back to that.
Yeah.
So the second one, see how are we doing for time here? Okay, let's make this the second one, our last one that we'll cover for this time. And the second one is the enhanced status of women and children. Now that might come as a surprise to people, but I think history does show an enhanced status, not perfection. A slow, gradual change, though. And it all started with Jesus and the way he treated women. In the gospel accounts about Martha and Mary, two close friends of his, in Luke chapter 10, for example, verses 38 to 42, and other accounts, suggested that Jesus broke with the conventions of his age, and he actually provided religious instruction to women. Now, that was a big change right there in the Jewish culture. And in ancient times, female infanticide was widespread, and it actually reduced the number of women in society. I mean, this was just typical. Phrases like, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it, was a saying that men would say to their wives when they were pregnant. Unbelievable.
Well, really. Michael, I was in another country, which I'll not mention here, but it's definitely not a Christian country. There's another major religion, but I was there and I picked up a newspaper and it happened to talk about they did a ultrasound raid. They raided a place that was running an ultrasound uh, clinic. And I thought, what's the problem with an ultrasound clinic? And it turned out
Yeah.
that in that particular country, if a woman is pregnant and it's a female, there is a highly disproportionate number of female children being aborted simply because of what you exactly said there. Now, this is I want to make it clear, this was very definitely not a Christian country or a country where Christianity is looked on with great positivity. So it continues
Well,
to this day.
oh, it does. And there's a long history of this. And that's what I'm referring to here in the pagan world within which Christianity sort of showed up in. This was the common view. If it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it. So there were frequent abortions entailing great risk. It killed many women. They killed many women, and it left many more of them barren. But since the Christian community practiced neither abortion nor infanticide, women were drawn to Christianity. But there were large numbers of women in early Christianity. And more importantly, women within the Christian community enjoyed higher status and higher security than pagan women would. I mean, pagan women were usually married off at a very young age, often before puberty, to much older men. But Christian women were older when they were married, had more choice in whom and even if they would marry. And this came out of the teaching of Jesus and the Old Testament on marriage. In addition, Christian men could easily or could not easily divorce their wives, and both genders were subject to strongly enforced rules against extramarital sex, which helped the marriages last. And the last point I'll make here is we have it from the Apostle Paul and confirmed by Roman sources that women held positions of leadership in the church that were unheard of in that culture. It may not be what the modern person might think is good enough, but it was a radical change early in Christianity and has continued. But I know we will have to answer the question of, wait a minute, what about the patriarchy at some point? But let's make it clear there was a definite enhancement of the status of women and children in the Jesus Revolution.
It reminds me of another verse in the New Testament where it says that if a man has done something against his wife, the Lord will not hear his prayers. He needs to make that right with his wife, and treat his wife, even go to the point of laying his life down for his wife, which is the highest price. The husband was required to be prepared to pay the highest price for the well-being of his wife.
Absolutely. And I just realized I didn't get to the part where I gave a bit more detail on the enhanced status of the children. I mostly talked about the enhanced status of the woman. So let me just finish with this. And I'm taking this from a Breakpoint a podcast. Breakpoint is part of the Colson Center. It's Charles Colson started. He was one of the people that worked in in Richard Nixon's term, and he actually was convicted and sent to jail for the Watergate thing and became a Christian in jail. And after he served his time, he came out and was very outspoken, an active Christian. And one of the things he started was a prison ministry. And he's kind of was one of my heroes too. I love the way that he emphasized both evangelism and making a social impact as Christians as well. So, taken from this this short podcast, they say the following: years ago, a theologian named O.M. Backey published a book titled "When Children Became People and the Birth of Childhood in Early Christianity." Now, in it, Vacchi noticed that the idea of children as fully human with infinite value and inalienable rights was a distinctly Christian invention. In the ancient world, children were beaten, ignored, left to die, and sexualized with alarming regularity. However, this changed because of Christians who adopted unwanted children, condemned their sexualization, and embraced their God given role as parents. And Vacchi quoted the charge given by the 5th century church father John Chrysostom, who said, "Let everything take second place to our care for our children, our bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Ponder deeply how you can teach your child to think lightly of this life's passing glories. Thus he will become truly renowned and glorious." And of course, Jesus commanded his disciples, let the little children come to me, and issued a dire warning to anyone who would cause a child to stumble. Because of Christians, the idea of childhood came into existence. Just think about that for a minute. Childhood. There's such a thing as a period of time when you are a child, and there's a certain way that you are to be. Protecting play may seem like an insignificant way for Christians to take our place in this aspect of the Christian story, but play reveals a part of who God made us to be, and this is especially true for children. Play also points us to the generous, joyful heart of God. As G.K. Chesterton once quipped, quote, "It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we." So this is all to make the point that Christianity led to an enhanced status of women and children. Was it perfect? No. Is it perfect now? Definitely not. Have there been egregious errors and mistakes made even in this area? Yes, there have. And we'll need to talk about that. How does the good that we see fit with the bad, and what does all that mean? But for
Mhm.
now, my point today is that we are beginning to see some of the positive impact that Christianity brings, some of it by the actions of Christians themselves, just with their integrity, trying to live out the teachings of Jesus as best as they can. Some of it just from the worldview of Jesus, changing the way people think about what a human being is, for example, and what a child is, um, and whether people need to be treated with love and care, and so on and so forth. But we're going to see there's many more examples of change, and we will get into those in our next session.
Mhm. Well, this has been fascinating, Michael, and I'm glad we're doing these episodes. And if you're listening and you still have questions about some of the things we've said about the future episodes, please continue to follow this channel, because I can see from Michael's outline, which I have the benefit of seeing here, we've got a lot more to cover, and it is absolutely fascinating. And it's not the kind of stuff you'll often hear just in today's culture, but it is necessarily academic. It's the studies have been done, the history books have been written and reevaluated, and there's it's we're going to see it's no more than just quite remarkable what Christianity has done, but it's almost well, it's transformational, as Michael said, in his transformed human history.
And I'm hopeful that getting more people aware of this will also be transformational.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's very encouraging to hear, because we're just inundated with information, true, false, and semi-true and semi-false, and it's really helpful to just wade through this very carefully and meticulously, like we're going to be doing in these episodes. So thanks again, Michael, for doing this.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining me, Kirk. Look forward to next time.
It's my pleasure. Bye for now.
Bye.